photograph is a fragment of a second, frozen in time. It captures a smile, a hug, a moment of joy. But what if that image is a lie? What if the light we see on our screens is merely a shadow cast by a deep, devouring darkness? We live in an era where reality is curated, and the truth is often buried beneath a mountain of likes and shares. This is the story of the Hart family, a family that appeared to be the pinnacle of progressive modern love, until the world watched them vanish into the Pacific mist. It is a story where the pursuit of a perfect digital persona eventually led to a horrific 100-foot plunge into the abyss. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the tragedy that unfolded on a lonely stretch of the California coast, we must first look back at the two women who stood at the center of it all. Jennifer Jean Hart and Sarah Margaret Gengler were both born in 1979, coming of age in the quiet, expansive landscapes of South Dakota. They were two young women who felt they were destined for something greater than the small-town life they were born into. They met while attending Northern State University, and for those who saw them together, the connection was immediate. They weren't just a couple, they were a unit. Two people who shared a fierce, almost evangelical desire to leave a mark on the world. By the mid-2000s, Jennifer and Sarah had settled into a life that mirrored the ideals they championed. Jennifer, or Jen as everyone called her, was the charismatic leader. She was tall, with a voice that commanded attention and a presence that seemed to radiate positive energy. Sarah was the quiet anchor, the one who worked steady jobs, including a long tenure at a Kohl's department store, to provide the financial stability the family required. Together, they made a decision that would change the course of 8 lives. They decided to become mothers. But they didn't want just any family. They wanted to save children who had been discarded by the system. In 2006, while living in Alexandria, Minnesota, the couple adopted their first set of siblings from Texas, Marcus, Hannah, and Abigail. These were children who had come from a background of neglect, and the Harts presented themselves as the ultimate saviors. To the outside world, it was a beautiful act of compassion. Then, in 2009, they expanded their family again, adopting another sibling group of 3 from Texas, Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra. Now they were a family of 8, 2 white mothers and 6 black children. It was a visual statement that Jen Hart leaned into with every fiber of her being. The Harts were the Earth Moms. They were the family you would see at a Wandering Sage festival or a Bernie Sanders rally, decked out in tie-dye dreadlocks and colorful headbands. Jen's Facebook page was a meticulously curated gallery of this life. There were photos of the children posing in sun-drenched fields, pictures of organic home-cooked meals, and long poetic captions about choosing love and living authentically. Jen was a master of the digital narrative. She didn't just post updates. She told a story of a tribe that had overcome the trauma of their past through the power of her and Sarah's unconditional love. But as the likes piled up, the reality inside the Hart household was beginning to fray, and the first cracks appeared long before the final tragedy. The children, despite the smiling photos, were rarely seen by neighbors. When they were, they appeared smaller than they should have been for their ages. They were described as waif-like, with a strange, haunting stillness about them. In 2011, while still in Minnesota, the darkness behind the curtain was briefly exposed. 6-year-old Abigail told a teacher that she had owies on her tummy and back. When the school investigated, they found bruises. Sarah Hart eventually pleaded guilty to domestic assault and was sentenced to a year of probation. She told investigators that things had gotten out of hand while she was disciplining the child in the bathroom. Rather than addressing the underlying issues, the Harts did what they would do many times over the following decade. They moved. They left Minnesota for West Lynn, Oregon, an affluent suburb where they could blend into the liberal landscape. Here, Jen decided to pull the children out of public school. She claimed she was unschooling them, a philosophy that allowed children to follow their own interests. In reality, it was a way to isolate them. The children were now under Jen's control 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were no longer students, they were props in her grand production. The most famous of these props was Devonte Hart. In 2014, a photograph of Devonte went viral, capturing the hearts of millions. It showed the young boy, tears streaming down his face, hugging a white police officer during a protest in Portland. He was wearing a sign that said, "Free Hugs." To the world, Devonte was a symbol of hope and racial reconciliation. To Jennifer Hart, he was a celebrity who brought her the validation she craved. But behind that viral hug was a boy who, according to later reports, was so hungry he was begging neighbors for food. In 2017, the family moved once more, this time to a large, secluded home in Woodland, Washington. The house sat on 2 acres, hidden from the road by a long driveway and thick trees. It was the perfect place for a family that wanted to be left alone, and the perfect place for a house of horrors to remain hidden. Neighbors in Woodland would later recount how they almost never saw the children outside playing. There were no toys in the yard, no bicycles, no laughter. The only thing they saw was Jennifer, sitting on her porch, staring out into the distance, and the children, occasionally lined up like soldiers to help with chores. As the family entered 2018, the walls were closing in. The children were becoming teenagers, and their smallness, which Jen had always attributed to their biological backgrounds, was becoming impossible to ignore. Hannah, then 16, was so emaciated she looked like she was barely 10 years old. Devonte, the face of the family, was 15 but weighed only 100 pounds. They were living in a beautiful house in a beautiful neighborhood, surrounded by the love their mothers preached. But they were starving in the shadows of their own home. The digital world saw a family of light and love, but the neighbors saw something very different. On a cold morning in March 2018, the DeKalb family, who lived next door, were startled by a knock at their door. Standing there was Devonte. He didn't look like the boy from the free hugs photo. He looked terrified. He told the DeKalbs that his mothers were punishing them by withholding food. He begged them to leave a bag of crackers by the fence for him and his siblings. He told them his mothers were mean and that he was scared. This wasn't just a cry for help. It was the beginning of the end. The DeKalbs eventually contacted Child Protective Services, CPS. On Friday, March 23, 2018, a CPS worker pulled up the long driveway in Woodland and knocked on the Hart's door. No one answered. But inside, Jennifer and Sarah Hart knew the truth was finally catching up to them. The mask was slipping, and for Jennifer Hart, a life without her curated perfection was a life not worth living. The story of Jennifer and Sarah didn't begin with a bang. It began with a shared sense of displacement. In the late 90s, the campus of Northern State University in Aberdeen, South Dakota, was a world of vast prairies and traditional values. For 2 young women exploring their identities, it must have felt like a beautiful, isolated cage. Jennifer Hart and Sarah Gengler found in each other a mirror, a reflection of the people they wanted to become. They weren't just a couple, they were an alliance. Their bond was forged in a mutual desire to reject the norm of their upbringing and build something revolutionary, something that the world would have to stop and notice. By 2004, the two had moved to Alexandria, Minnesota. This was the honeymoon phase of their life together, a time of exploration and grand plans. Jennifer was the creative engine, the one who painted their future in vibrant, impossible colors. Sarah was the worker, the silent provider who allowed Jennifer's dreams to take flight. They bought a modest home, they joined local community groups, and they began to craft the image of the perfect progressive couple. But there was a restlessness in Jennifer. A house and a partner weren't enough to satisfy the hunger she felt for validation. She needed a larger stage. She needed a legacy. In 2006, that legacy began to take shape. The couple decided to adopt. They didn't just want one child. They wanted to provide a forever home for children who had seen the worst of the system. They went to Texas, where they were matched with 3 siblings, Marcus, Hannah, and Abigail. To the caseworkers, Jennifer and Sarah were a godsend. They were educated, stable, and seemingly overflowing with love. When the girls and their brother arrived in Minnesota, Jennifer's Facebook page, which was then in its infancy, erupted with joy. She spoke of healing souls and building a tribe. For a while, the world believed her. Friends in Alexandria saw the Harts at local parks, the children dressed in matching outfits, their hair neatly braided. Jennifer would talk for hours about their progress, how they were learning to trust again, how love was the only language spoken in their home. But behind the closed doors of that Minnesota house, a different language was being drafted, a language of control. The first red flag wasn't a scream. It was a whisper. In 2008, just 2 years after the first adoptions, local authorities received a tip. A teacher noticed that 6-year-old Hannah was coming to school with bruises. When questioned, Jennifer had an answer for everything. She spoke of the children's troubled backgrounds, of their reactive attachment disorder, and how their previous trauma made them prone to self-harm or clumsy accidents. She was so convincing, so articulate, that the investigation was closed. Jennifer didn't see this as a warning. She saw it as a challenge to her narrative. In 2009, despite the quiet whispers of concern, the Harts were allowed to adopt again. Another sibling group from Texas, Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra. Now the Hart tribe was complete. 2 mothers, 6 children, all living under the banner of choosing love. Jennifer's social media presence became a full-time occupation. She wasn't just a mother, she was a brand. She posted photos of the kids holding signs with inspirational quotes, pictures of them at festivals, and long, winding essays about the beauty of their multicolored family. But the reality was beginning to rot from the inside out. In 2010, 6-year-old Abigail, the youngest of the first group, told a teacher that she was being hit. She said Jennifer had pushed her into a wall. This time, the state of Minnesota didn't look away. During the investigation, it was Sarah Hart who stepped forward to take the fall. She claimed that Jennifer was the loving one and that she, Sarah, had simply lost her cool during a disciplinary session in the bathroom. In 2011, Sarah pleaded guilty to domestic assault. This should have been the end. The system should have stepped in. But Jennifer Hart was a master of the pivot. She used the conviction to further isolate her family. She told her followers that they were being persecuted by a system that didn't understand their unconventional parenting. She claimed the state was biased against their lifestyle. And then she made the tactical decision that would seal the children's fate. She pulled them out of the public school system forever. Unschooling, Jennifer called it. She claimed the children were too sensitive for the harshness of the traditional classroom. She said they were learning from nature, from art, from the rhythm of life. In truth, she was removing the last set of eyes that could see the bruises. She was cutting the children off from the only people who might have saved them. The family moved to West Lynn, Oregon, a suburb of Portland that prided itself on its weirdness and its tolerance. Here, the Harts became local celebrities in the progressive scene. They were the family you saw at the farmer's market, the ones who always seemed to be in a state of bliss. Jennifer's Facebook posts became even more frequent, even more poetic. She spoke of the children as enlightened beings who didn't need the constraints of society. But neighbors in West Lynn began to notice things that didn't fit the Facebook captions. They saw the children standing in the yard for hours, perfectly still, like statues. They noticed that the kids never seemed to grow. Hannah, who was a teenager, looked like a small child. They were thin, painfully thin. When neighbors offered the children food, Jennifer would intervene, claiming they had severe food allergies or eating disorders stemming from their past neglect. The honeymoon was over, and the power struggle that Stephen Grant had felt in his own marriage, that same need for absolute control, was manifesting in Jennifer in a much more psychological way. She didn't just want to be the breadwinner, she wanted to be the god of her own small world. The most chilling example of this control was the 2014 free hugs photo of Devante. To the world, it was a moment of pure, raw emotion. Devante, a black boy, hugging a white police officer during the Ferguson protests in Portland. The photo went global. It was featured on news outlets from New York to London. Jennifer basked in the glory. She wrote that Devante had felt the need to spread love in a world of hate. But while the world saw a boy who loved, the people who lived near the Harts saw a boy who was starving. Shortly after that photo went viral, Devante began sneaking out of the house. He would go to the neighbors, begging for food. Not just a snack. He wanted anything. Bread, crackers, leftovers. He told them he was hungry. He told them his mothers were punishing the family by not letting them eat for days at a time. The neighbors in Oregon eventually called the authorities. But again, Jennifer Hart worked her magic. She told the investigators that Devante was manipulative, a trait she blamed on his biological mother. She said he was obsessed with food because of his early childhood trauma and that they were actually on a strict, healthy diet to help him heal. Once again, the case was closed. Jennifer didn't see this as a close call. She saw it as proof that she was untouchable. In 2017, the pressure in Oregon became too much. The neighbors were watching. The authorities were asking questions. So, the Harts did what they always did when the truth got too close. They fled. They moved to Woodland, Washington, to a house hidden by trees at the end of a long gravel drive, a house where no one could see them. In this new home, the isolation was total. The Hart tribe was now a closed circuit. Sarah worked long hours at Kohl's, coming home to a house ruled by Jennifer's moods. The children were no longer children. They were workers in Jennifer's digital factory. They spent their days cleaning, posing for photos, and rehearsing the happiness that Jennifer required for her Facebook updates. But the hunger couldn't be rehearsed. The children were becoming desperate. Hannah, Jeremiah, Marcus. They were all reaching their late teens, yet none of them weighed more than 100 pounds. They were living in a constant state of caloric deprivation, a house of horrors wrapped in tie-dye and organic linens. The relationship between Jennifer and Sarah had shifted from a partnership to a cult of two. Sarah, who had once been the quiet provider, was now a co-conspirator in the slow destruction of 6 lives. She saw the ribs. She saw the sunken eyes. She saw the way the children flinched when Jennifer raised her voice. But she stayed. She kept working. She kept providing the money that allowed Jennifer to maintain the illusion. By early 2018, the mask was beginning to crumble. The digital persona that Jennifer had spent over a decade building was being threatened by the one thing she couldn't control: the children's will to survive. Devante's knocks on the DeKalb family's door in March of 2018 weren't just a request for crackers. They were a death warrant for the perfect life Jennifer Hart had created. The CPS visit on March 23rd was the final straw. For Jennifer Hart, the thought of the world seeing the real Hannah, the 16-year-old who weighed 70 pounds, was worse than death. If she couldn't be the savior she had promised the world, then she wouldn't be anything at all, and she wouldn't let the children exist without her. The relationship that began on a college campus in South Dakota, fueled by a dream of authenticity, had turned into a suicide pact. A pact that included 6 innocent children who had already been failed by everyone who was supposed to protect them. The abyss wasn't just at the bottom of a cliff in California. It had been in their home for years. The clock began its final relentless countdown on Friday, March 23rd, 2018. It was a day that started like any other in the secluded, wood-shrouded house in Woodland, Washington, but the air inside that home was already heavy with a terminal kind of tension. The Hart children, Marcus, Hannah, Abigail, Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra, were prisoners of a routine that had become a slow-motion nightmare. They were hungry, they were tired, and they were living under the absolute, suffocating shadow of Jennifer Hart's shifting moods. For years, the family had moved across state lines to outrun the truth, but on this Friday, the truth finally walked up the driveway and knocked on the front door. It was a representative from Child Protective Services. They were there because the neighbors, the DeKalbs, had finally seen past the tie-dye and the smiles. They had seen the terror in Devontae's eyes as he begged for bread. They had heard Hannah's desperate pleas in the middle of the night. As the officials stood on the porch, knocking, the house remained deathly silent. Inside, the Harts were huddled together, holding their breath. Jennifer and Sarah knew that if they opened that door, the game was over. They knew that a single glance at the children's skeletal frames would be enough to dismantle the entire digital empire Jen had spent 12 years constructing. The knock went unanswered. But for Jennifer, that sound was the tolling of a bell. The walls were finally, truly closing in. As soon as the CPS vehicle pulled away, the panic inside the house transitioned into a cold, mechanical efficiency. There would be no more unschooling lessons. There would be no more staged photo shoots in the yard. Jennifer and Sarah began to pack, but they weren't packing for a new life or another relocation. They were packing for a finality that only they understood. They loaded the family's 2003 GMC Yukon XL, a massive gold-colored SUV that had carried them through thousands of miles of performance and pretense. They didn't pack toys. They didn't pack school books. They packed the essentials for a long, one-way journey. The flight from Woodland began under the cover of darkness. As the SUV turned off the gravel drive and onto the main road, heading south toward the Oregon border, the children likely believed this was just another sudden move, another adventure to a new place where things might finally get better. They settled into the cramped rows of the Yukon, 6 children squeezed into a space that had become their mobile cage. The heater hummed against the March chill, and the Pacific Northwest landscape blurred into a series of dark, looming shadows outside the windows. Jennifer was behind the wheel, her grip on the steering wheel tight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, perhaps staring at the glowing dashboard, already retreating into the pharmacological haze that would define her final hours. They drove through the night, crossing into Oregon. The 101 highway became their artery, a winding path that clung to the jagged edges of the coast. For the children, the passage of time must have been a blur of hunger and exhaustion. There were no stops at roadside diners. There were no happy meals. To the world watching through Jen's Facebook, they were the Hart tribe, a family of light. To the gas station attendants who saw them in the dead of night, they were a silent, ghost-like group. By Saturday morning, the Harts had reached the rugged beauty of Northern California. This was a landscape that Jennifer had always romanticized. The towering redwoods, the crashing surf, the feeling of being at the very edge of the world. But the beauty was lost on the 8 passengers of the Yukon. Jennifer's phone records would later reveal a chilling glimpse into her mental state during this drive. She wasn't looking for hotels. She wasn't looking for help. She was searching the internet for information on suicide, death by drowning, and how much Benadryl does it take to kill a child. The plan was no longer a frantic reaction. It was a calculated execution. On the morning of March 24th, the Yukon pulled into a Safeway grocery store in Fort Bragg, California. This is one of the last times the world would see Jennifer Hart alive. Security footage captured her walking through the aisles, a tall woman in a black jacket, her hair pulled back, moving with a purposeful, eerie calm. She bought groceries, fruit, chips, and a large quantity of Benadryl. She stood at the checkout counter, interacting with the clerk, appearing for all the world like a mother on a family road trip. But there were no children with her in the store. They remained in the car, hidden behind the tinted glass, waiting for a mother who was currently purchasing the tools of their destruction. As Saturday turned into Sunday, the Yukon began to linger. They weren't just driving anymore, they were searching for a location. They spent hours idling in turnouts along Highway 1 in Mendocino County. This stretch of road is legendary for its beauty and its danger. A narrow ribbon of asphalt perched hundreds of feet above the churning cold waters of the Pacific. It is a place of mist and salt spray where the land simply ends. Inside the SUV, the atmosphere had shifted into something truly horrific. Investigators would later find that Sarah Hart had a massive amount of diphenhydramine, Benadryl, in her system. The children, too, had been drugged. Jennifer had likely mixed the liquid medication into their drinks, perhaps telling them it was a special treat or something to help them sleep through the long drive. One by one, the children began to drift off. Their breathing slowed, their heads lolled against the headrests. The hunger that had defined their lives was finally being replaced by a heavy, chemical slumber. Marcus, who was 19 but weighed only 90 pounds. Hannah, who was 16 and so fragile. Abigail, Jeremiah, Sierra, and Devante. The boy whose smile had traveled across the globe was now unconscious in the back of a gold SUV, his fate being decided by the woman he had once called his hero. Jennifer Hart, however, remained awake. She was the pilot of this final mission. Her blood alcohol level was later measured at 0.102, above the legal limit, but not high enough to cause an accident. She was functional. She was aware. She spent those final hours sitting in the driver's seat, perhaps watching the waves crash against the rocks 100 feet below. She watched the sun set over the Pacific, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. She looked at Sarah, her partner of 20 years, who was now unresponsive beside her. She looked in the rearview mirror at the 6 children who were the only proof of her perfect life. If she let them live, the truth would come out. The world would see the starvation. They would see the bruises. They would see the unschooling for the fraud it was. The Jen Hart brand would be dismantled piece by piece on the nightly news. To Jennifer, the ego was more important than the lives she claimed to have saved. If the story couldn't have a happy ending, she would ensure it had no ending at all. She would simply erase the characters. Late Sunday night, or perhaps in the early gray hours of Monday morning, Jennifer Hart put the Yukon into gear. She was parked at a dirt turnout overlooking the ocean near Juan Creek. There were no skid marks found at the scene. This wasn't a moment of panic or a loss of control. It was a deliberate, steady acceleration. The heavy SUV moved forward, leaving the safety of the gravel. It traveled about 70 feet across the flat, grassy area of the turnout. Jennifer kept her foot on the gas. The speedometer climbed, 20 miles per hour, 30, 40. The Yukon reached the very edge of the cliff, a 100-foot drop into the jagged rocks and the surging tide. For a fraction of a second, the massive vehicle must have hung in the air, a gold speck against the vastness of the Pacific night. Then, gravity took hold. The impact was catastrophic. The Yukon hit the rocks below nose first before flipping onto its roof. The sound of the crash, the crushing of metal, the shattering of glass, was swallowed instantly by the roar of the ocean. There were no screams. The children were too heavily sedated to even know the end had come. Jennifer and Sarah were killed instantly as the roof of the vehicle collapsed under the weight of the fall. The Pacific Ocean, cold and indifferent, began to wash over the wreckage, pulling the secrets of the Hart family into its depths. When the sun rose on Monday, March 26th, the gold SUV was visible from the road above, resting upside down on the rocks. To the first responders who rappelled down the cliffside, it looked like a tragic accident. But as they began to recover the bodies, the 2 women in the front, the small, emaciated frames of the children in the back, a much darker picture began to emerge. They found the Benadryl. They found the lack of skid marks. And they found a family that had been fleeing a reality they could no longer contain. The day X of the Hart family didn't end with a rescue. It ended exactly where Jennifer Hart intended, in the silence of the abyss. She had managed to orchestrate one last horrific event that the world would be forced to watch. But this time, she couldn't control the narrative. This time, the likes wouldn't save her. The final 24 hours of the Harts were a journey from a house of hidden hunger to a cliffside of ultimate betrayal, a journey fueled by the desperate need to keep a lie alive, even if it meant extinguishing the lives of 6 innocent souls who had only ever wanted a place to belong. As the tide came in, the gold SUV was partially submerged, and the names of the children, Marcus, Hannah, Abigail, Jeremiah, and Sierra, became part of a recovery effort that would haunt the state of California for years. And Devontae, the boy from the photo, he was gone. His body was never found in the initial wreckage, leaving a lingering, ghostly question mark on the edge of the Pacific. A boy who had spent his life seeking a hug was now lost to the sea, a final victim of a love that was actually a death sentence. The morning of March 26, 2018, dawned with a heavy gray shroud over the Mendocino coast, a typical Northern California morning where the mist clings to the jagged rocks like a damp blanket. Highway 1, that winding, treacherous ribbon of asphalt, was quiet, save for the occasional roar of the surf 100 feet below. It was a passing motorist, pulling into a scenic turnout near Juan Creek, who first noticed that something was terribly wrong. Peering over the edge of the overlook, a place meant for photographs and awe, they saw a flash of gold against the dark, churning water. It was the underbelly of a car, a massive vehicle, resting upside down on the rocks, its wheels pointing toward the indifferent sky. When the first responders from the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office arrived, they faced a scene that was as logistically difficult as it was emotionally devastating. The cliff was a sheer drop, 100 feet of crumbling earth and sharp stone. They had to rappel down, their ropes swaying in the salt spray, toward a wreck that was being battered by the incoming tide. As they reached the gold GMC Yukon, the smell of gasoline and salt air filled their lungs. The vehicle was crushed, its roof flattened, its windows shattered into a million glinting diamonds. The recovery began in silence. Inside the front of the cabin, they found 2 women. Jennifer Hart was still behind the wheel, her body held in place by the twisted metal. Sarah Hart was in the passenger seat. Both were dead, their faces pale and fixed in the finality of the impact. But as the officers moved toward the rear of the vehicle, the tragedy took on a dimension that none of them were prepared for. Squeezed into the back, among the luggage and the debris of a life on the run, were the bodies of 3 children, Marcus, Jeremiah, and Abigail. They were so small. Even Marcus, who was 19 years old, looked like a young boy in the wreckage. Their bodies were recovered with a grim, practiced efficiency, hauled up the cliffside in baskets as the sun began to burn through the fog. But as the investigators began to run the registration of the vehicle and cross-reference the names of the deceased, a chilling realization took hold. The Hart family didn't have 3 children. They had 6. Where were Devontae, Hannah, and Sierra? Suddenly, what had looked like a tragic traffic accident transformed into a massive, multi-state disappearance investigation. The California Highway Patrol and the FBI were called in. They looked at the turnout, the place where the gold SUV had left the road. There were no skid marks, no signs of a sudden swerve to avoid a deer or a patches of ice, just a straight, determined path across 70 feet of dirt and grass, ending at the abyss. While search teams in California began to comb the shoreline, another team of investigators was racing toward the Hart's home in Woodland, Washington, nearly 500 miles to the north. They expected to find a house in disarray, perhaps a sign of a struggle, or maybe the 3 missing children waiting for their parents to return. Instead, they found a tomb. The house at the end of the long gravel drive was perfectly still. It was a beautiful, sprawling home, but as the police crossed the threshold, the perfect image began to dissolve. The house was clean, strangely clean. There were no toys on the floor, no colorful drawings on the refrigerator, no signs of the chaotic, vibrant life Jennifer Hart had described so vividly on Facebook. In the kitchen, they found a refrigerator stocked with organic food, but the house felt hollow, like a stage set after the actors had fled. The search of the property revealed something even more disturbing. In the trash, they found discarded items that suggested a frantic departure. But it was the testimonies of the neighbors, specifically the DeKalb family, that finally provided the context for the disappearance. The DeKalbs told the police about the knocks in the night. They told them about Hannah Hart, who had showed up at their door months earlier, missing 2 front teeth, begging them to hide her. They told them about Devontae, who had spent the weeks leading up to the crash begging for food, claiming his mothers were starving him as punishment. The perfect family was a lie, and the 3 missing children were now the subjects of a frantic, desperate search. Back in California, the search for Devontae, Hannah, and Sierra had become a battle against the elements. The Pacific Ocean in March is a violent, unpredictable force. The search teams used drones, helicopters, and side-scan sonar. They walked the beaches for miles, looking for any sign of a child's shoe or a piece of clothing. Divers attempted to enter the water near the crash site, but the surge, the powerful underwater movement of the tide, was too dangerous. They were searching for bodies in a place that didn't like to give them up. A week passed, then 2. The nation was captivated by the mystery. The free hugs photo of Devontae was everywhere again, but now it was a haunting reminder of a boy who had vanished into the mist. People held vigils. They left flowers at the top of the cliff in Mendocino, but the ocean remained silent. It wasn't until weeks later that the water began to yield its grim secrets. The body of a small girl was found floating near McCarricher State Park, several miles north of the crash site. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already feared. It was Sierra Hart. Not long after, another set of remains was discovered on a beach in Georgia Pacific, identified as Hannah. But Devontae, the face of the family, the boy the world felt they knew, was nowhere to be found. The search continued for months. Every piece of debris, every bone found on the Northern California coast was tested and retested. The investigators looked at the currents, they looked at the tides, they tried to map where the ocean might have carried a 15-year-old boy. But as the weeks turned into months, the search transitioned from a rescue to a recovery, and eventually to a cold case of the most heartbreaking kind. The disappearance of the Hart family wasn't just a physical vanishing, it was the vanishing of a myth. As the police delved into Jennifer's digital life, they found a woman who was obsessed with her image, even as she planned the end. They found Sarah's text messages, which spoke of a mounting, quiet desperation. The search for the family was over, but the search for the truth was only beginning. In the end, the gold SUV on the rocks was the only punctuation mark on a story that Jennifer Hart had tried to edit until the very last second. 5 of the children had been recovered from the surf, their bodies telling a story of starvation and sedation that their mothers had tried to hide. But Devontae remained a ghost, a final, lingering piece of a puzzle that refused to be completed. The search for the Hart family ended not with a resolution, but with a vast, empty horizon over the Pacific, a place where the truth had been driven off a cliff and buried in 100 feet of cold, dark water. The world watched as the divers packed their gear and the helicopters stopped their patrols. The Hart tribe was gone. The house in Woodland was sold. The Facebook page was eventually taken down. But for the investigators who stood on that cliffside in Mendocino, the search would never truly be over. They would always look at the gray water and wonder about the boy who wasn't there, The boy who had slipped through the fingers of the law, the system, and eventually the sea itself. As the gold GMC Yukon was winched up the side of that 100-foot cliff, dripping with seawater and tangled with kelp, the investigation moved from the shoreline into the sterile, unforgiving light of the laboratory and the digital forensic suite. This wasn't a search for a motive. The motive was written in every dent of that crushed metal. It was a search for the depth of a betrayal. The investigators in Mendocino County and the FBI began to peel back the layers of the Hart family, and what they found was a systemic, calculated erasure of 6 human beings. It was an investigation that would eventually reveal that the plunge into the abyss didn't happen in a single second on a Monday morning. It had been happening for years, one withheld meal at a time. The first and perhaps most damning piece of evidence came from the toxicology reports. In a case involving a massive vehicle traveling at high speed off a cliff, you expect to find signs of a mechanical failure or a sudden medical emergency. You look for skid marks, for the smell of burnt rubber, for any indication that the driver tried to stop. But there was nothing. The investigation confirmed that the Yukon had been at a full stop at a dirt turnout before Jennifer Hart pinned the accelerator. There was no braking. There was no steering away. When the blood work came back for the occupants, the accident narrative disintegrated entirely. Sarah Hart, the quiet provider, had a staggering amount of diphenhydramine, Benadryl, in her system. She wasn't just sleepy, she was incapacitated. She was a passenger in the truest, most tragic sense of the word. And the children? Marcus, Jeremiah, Abigail, Sierra, and Hannah. They too were saturated with the drug. The investigation revealed that Jennifer had essentially turned the SUV into a rolling sedative chamber. These children, who had spent their lives being told they were part of a tribe of love, were drugged into a chemical stupor so they wouldn't, or couldn't, scream as their mother drove them toward the edge of the world. Jennifer Hart, however, was the only one who remained functional. Her toxicology showed a blood alcohol level of 0.102. In the eyes of the law, she was intoxicated, but in the eyes of the forensic psychologists, she was just drunk enough to follow through with the plan. She hadn't passed out. She hadn't lost motor control. She had made a conscious, sober-minded decision to murder her family. The digital investigation proved to be even more chilling. Detectives seized the computers and phones from the Woodland house, and what they found was a woman who was methodically researching her own exit strategy. Jennifer's search history in the days leading up to the crash was a roadmap to a massacre. She hadn't been looking for a new home or a way to fight the CPS allegations. She was Googling, how much Benadryl for a 100-pound child? Is death by drowning painful? Can you survive a 100-foot fall into water? She was cold. She was clinical. She was a director scouting the final scene of her own movie. But the investigation had to look beyond the toxicology to answer the why. They turned to the children's bodies, the silent witnesses. The autopsies of the recovered children told a story that Jennifer's Facebook page had spent a decade suppressing. These were teenagers who should have been growing, flourishing, and entering adulthood. Instead, the medical examiner found that their bodies were in a state of chronic, severe malnutrition. Marcus was 19 years old, but he had the bone density and weight of a much younger child. Their stomachs were empty. Their growth was stunted. The investigation concluded that the Hart children hadn't just been disciplined. They had been starved. This led the investigators back to the neighbors. The testimony of the DeKalb family became the emotional core of the case. They recounted how the Hart children would wait until Jennifer was occupied or out of the house to run across the property line. They described Hannah showing up in the middle of the night, her hair matted, her teeth missing, whispering that her mothers were mean and that she was not allowed to eat. They described Devante, the boy the world saw as a symbol of racial healing, standing in their kitchen, shaking as he ate a stolen piece of fruit, terrified that Jennifer would find out. The investigation into the free hugs photo was perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation of all. To the millions who shared that image, it was a moment of hope. To the investigators, it was a moment of exploitation. They discovered that Jennifer had orchestrated the entire protest trip to Portland. She had put the sign in Devontae's hands. She had positioned him. And when the photo went viral, she used the fame to shield herself from further scrutiny. The more famous the Harts became, the more the authorities were hesitant to investigate them. They were a model family, and Jennifer knew exactly how to use that as a weapon. As the forensic audit of the Woodland house continued, investigators found that the isolation was absolute. There were no signs of unschooling materials. No books, no art supplies, no traces of the intellectual curiosity Jennifer claimed to foster. The children didn't have friends. They didn't have outside contacts. They were a closed system, a cult of personality where Jennifer was the high priestess and Sarah was the enforcer. The investigation revealed a pattern of punishment cycles, periods where the children were forbidden from speaking, forbidden from looking each other in the eye, and, most cruelly, forbidden from eating. The investigation also touched on the failure of the system. Detectives tracked the family's movements from Minnesota to Oregon to Washington. They found that every time a report was filed, every time a teacher or a neighbor noticed a bruise or a skeletal frame, the Harts would simply pack up and move. They exploited the lack of communication between state agencies. They jurisdiction hopped to stay one step ahead of the truth. Jennifer used her status as a white, middle-class, progressive mother to deflect suspicion. She was articulate, she was enlightened, and she knew exactly how to speak the language of social workers to make them feel that they were the ones being unreasonable. Even the vehicle itself provided evidence. The GMC Yukon XL was a heavy, stable machine. It took a significant amount of force and a sustained press of the pedal to drive it across 70 feet of rough terrain and off that ledge. There was no mechanical failure found in the steering column or the brakes. The investigation concluded that the car did exactly what Jennifer Hart commanded it to do. It was a 6,000-pound murder weapon. In the final months of the investigation, as the search for Devontae's remains continued fruitlessly, the authorities were forced to confront a haunting reality. Jennifer Hart hadn't just killed her children to escape the law. She had killed them because she couldn't stand the thought of them existing without her narrative. She didn't want them to go into foster care and tell the truth. She didn't want the likes to turn into comments of horror. To Jennifer, the children weren't people. They were extensions of her own ego. If she was going to be deleted, they had to be deleted too. The investigation closed with a grim certainty. There were no unanswered questions regarding the cause of the crash. It was a mass murder-suicide, meticulously planned and executed by a woman who chose her own digital reputation over the lives of 6 children. The investigation block of this story doesn't end with a smoking gun. It ends with a mountain of evidence showing that for the Hart children, the world was a place of hunger and pretense, and the only person who was supposed to save them was the one who eventually led them into the sea. As the case files were boxed away, the investigators were left with the images of the Woodland house, a place that looked like a home but functioned like a prison. They were left with the toxicology reports that showed a family drugged into silence, and they were left with the realization that in the age of social media, the most dangerous place to be isn't in a dark alley. It's behind a perfect filter where the screams are drowned out by the sound of 1,000 likes. The legal resolution of the Hart family tragedy was not a trial in the traditional sense, for there were no living defendants to stand before a jury. Instead, the truth was excavated through a rare and somber legal proceeding known as a coroner's inquest, held in Willits, California, in early 2019. For 2 days, a 14-member jury listened to the mechanical and biological evidence that dismantled the perfect facade Jennifer Hart had so carefully maintained. The goal was to officially determine the manner of death for the 8 individuals who perished beneath the Mendocino cliffs. What emerged was a reconstruction of a crime so calculated that it left the courtroom in a state of stunned, heavy silence. The jury was presented with the chilling reality that this was a mass murder-suicide. The evidence was irrefutable. Jennifer Hart had intentionally steered the 2003 GMC Yukon XL off the 100-foot precipice. Investigators testified that there were no mechanical defects in the vehicle and, most tellingly, no evidence of braking at the scene. The jury heard how the SUV had accelerated from a stopped position, traveling across 70 feet of terrain with a heavy foot on the pedal until it cleared the edge. The manner of death for the 6 children was officially ruled as homicide at the hands of another, while Jennifer and Sarah's deaths were ruled as suicides. The inquest also served as a final public accounting of the victims. The names of the children, Marcus, Hannah, Abigail, Jeremiah, and Sierra, were read into the record alongside the brutal findings of their autopsies. The medical examiner testified to the staggering levels of Benadryl found in their systems, explaining that the children were likely unconscious or in a deep stupor when the vehicle hit the rocks. This chemical immobilization ensured there would be no struggle, no escape, and no survivors. The children who had spent their lives silenced by fear were, in their final moments, silenced by pharmacology. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the legal proceedings was the status of 15-year-old Devonte Hart. While the bodies of his 5 siblings had been recovered from the churning Pacific surf over the course of several weeks, Devonte remained missing. His death was legally presumed based on the circumstances of the crash, but the boy whose tear-streaked face had once represented a plea for racial harmony had been swallowed by the sea. In April 2019, a judge officially signed his death certificate, a paper-thin conclusion to a life that had been lived in the glare of a camera lens and the shadows of a starving home. The investigation and subsequent inquest also cast a harsh light on the systemic failure that allowed the Harts to continue their reign of terror. The jury heard how the family had moved across 3 different states, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington, to evade authorities. Every time a report of abuse or starvation surfaced, the Harts would simply jurisdiction hop, exploiting the lack of communication between state child welfare agencies. Jennifer's ability to manipulate social workers by using her progressive identity as a shield was noted as a primary reason why the children were never permanently removed from the home. While there were no prison sentences to be handed down, the trial of the Hart family in the court of public opinion was devastating. The revelation that the children were subjected to punishment cycles that included withholding food and forced silence for days on end shattered the myth of the Hart tribe. The digital evidence showed that Jennifer had been searching for suicide methods even as she was posting photos of the children smiling. It was a case where the sentencing was rendered not by a judge, but by the cold, hard facts of the children's physical condition, bodies that bore the marks of a decade of neglect. In the end, the legal resolution provided a grim closure. The case was officially closed, the death certificates were filed, and the House of Horrors in Woodland was eventually cleared of its remaining artifacts. But for the community of Mendocino and the neighbors who had tried to save the children, the sentence was a lifelong burden of what if. The inquest proved that the Harts didn't just fall off a cliff. They were driven there by a woman who would rather see her children dead than see her reputation destroyed. The trial of the Hart family ended with a final, official acknowledgement. They were victims of a mother who loved her image more than she loved their lives. The story of the Hart family remains one of the most chilling chapters in the annals of modern crime, serving as a stark, haunting reminder that the digital world we inhabit is often nothing more than a hall of mirrors. We look at the photos, we read the poetic captions about choosing love, and we desperately want to believe that beauty is truth. But for Marcus, Hannah, Abigail, Devante, Jeremiah, and Sierra. The light their mothers preached was a blinding glare used to hide a world of hunger, isolation, and terror. They were children who were saved from the foster system only to be sacrificed on the altar of a woman's insatiable ego. Jennifer Hart drove her family into the Pacific not because she was a mother in pain, but because she was a performer who refused to let the curtain fall on her lies. Today, the cliff in Mendocino stands as a silent, jagged monument to those 6 stolen lives, a place where the eternal roar of the ocean forever drowns out the hollow, empty sound of 1,000 likes. In the end, the only thing that was truly authentic about the Hart family was the tragedy they left behind in the cold salt spray and the dark, indifferent deep. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.